All right. So, the cult of Leonardo, as it has been called, began among the educated classes of Western Europe in the 19th century in conjunction with the so-called discovery of the Italian Renaissance. Before the year 1800, Leonardo was seldom discussed by anyone, even in Italy. The cult of Leonardo early involved the notion of him as a sort of irreligious freethinker or even esotericist. Stendhal, the famous French novelist, expressed the opinion that, quote, Leonardo was too intelligent to submit to the religion of his century, end quote. Now, such ideas go well with fantasies about Leonardo being an esoteric initiate. In Rhymes on the Road from 1819 by Irish poet and songwriter Thomas Moore, Leonardo was held up as a bearded sage who traced upon the dusky earth strange learned figures with his wand. He moreover spoke of Leonardo as one in an assembly of great magicians, and through his art a caster of potent spells. A sort of culmination of these ideas can be found in the celebrated 1869 essay on Leonardo by English author and art critic Walter Pater. Its forceful and flowery prose would capture the imagination of several generations to come, and ultimately permanently changed how paintings like the Mona Lisa, or more properly La Gioconda, were viewed. Pater claimed that later times had transformed Leonardo into a conventional figure, when in fact he was a bold speculator who set philosophy above Christianity. Yet, Pater asserted, it is still by a certain mystery in his work, and sometimes enigmatical beyond the usual measure of great men, that he fascinates, or perhaps half repels. According to Pater, Leonardo seemed to his contemporaries to be the possessor of some unsanctified and secret wisdom. The image sketched of him in Pater's essay thus turns the painter into an esotericist, a magician who brooded over the hidden virtues of plants and crystals, the lines traced by the stars as they moved in the sky, over the correspondences which exist between the different orders of living things, through which, to eyes opened, they interpret each other, and for years he seemed to those about him as one listening to a voice, silent to other men. The idea of Leonardo as a sorcerer of sorts permeates Pater's entire text, with enthusiastic phrasings such as the following. Poring over his crucibles, making experiments with color, trying, by a strange variation of the alchemist's dream, to discover the secret, not of an elixir to make man's natural life immortal, but of giving the immortality to the subtlest and most delicate effects of painting, he seemed to them rather the sorcerer or the magician, possessed of curious secrets and hidden knowledge, living in a world of which he alone possessed the key. As can be seen, Pater did not explicitly state that Leonardo was actually practicing sorcery, but he used parables and poetic images, very much blurring the line between artist and magician. According to Pater, what Leonardo's philosophy, quote, seems to have been most like is that of Paracelsus, and much of the spirit of the older alchemy still hangs about it, end quote. The pupils he chose, Pater asserted, were men possessing enough genius to be capable of initiation into his secret. Most of Pater's individual phrasings would have been intended figuratively, but taken as a whole, they created a strong impression of Leonardo as an esotericist. Accordingly, it followed naturally for the essayist to assume that Leonardo's paintings were depositories of secret knowledge in some sense. A case in point was St. John the Baptist, quote, whose treacherous smile would have us understand something far beyond the outward gesture or circumstance, end quote. Referring to Leonardo's painting Bacchus, Pater hinted that the strange likeness between this painting and that of St. John had something to do with paganism hidden in Christian symbolism. Writing of Leonardo's type of womanly beauty, Pater stated that the females in his paintings are not of the Christian family, but rather clairvoyants, through whom, as through delicate instruments, one becomes aware of the subtler forces of nature. These women feel powers at work in the common air unfelt by others, and, Pater again employing the typical language of esotericist discourse, they pass them on to us in a chain of secret influences. Let us next consider the example of Josephin Péladan, the founder of the esoteric order L'Ordre du Temple de la Rose-Croix in Paris, and a central figure in the esoteric milieu of the turn of the century Europe. And we also happen to have the world's foremost expert on Péladan sitting right next to me, so I'm a little bit embarrassed to be speaking on him. Famously, Péladan described the true artist as a magus and a priest, and played a pivotal role in the development of symbolist art. Between 1892 and 1897, Péladan organized exhibitions of idealist spiritual art, which were massively popular with the curious public. Through such endeavors, esoteric concepts were brought to the attention of the masses in an unprecedented way. While Péladan's eccentric persona was the object of much ridicule, it seemingly intrigued at least as much as it caused laughter. There can be little doubt that he possessed a veritable genius for publicity. For the first Rosicrucian exhibition, 2,000 invitations were sent out, and more than 22,600 calling cards were left by people who came to view it. Péladan discussed Leonardo in several publications. The most influential was probably his book-length manifesto, L'Art idéaliste et mystique, of 1894, where he had Mona Lisa herself state, "I am Da Vinci's gracious pentacle. I manifest his soul, which never settled because it soared too high and too deep. I have nothing to offer to passion, but if intelligence approaches me, it will be mirrored in the prism of my expression as in a multicolored mirror, and I will help some to become aware of themselves." The esoteric initiate who possesses the intelligence Péladan spoke of can, in other words, partake directly of the spiritual insights of the Renaissance master by contemplating La Gioconda, thereby reaching a higher level of transcendent self-awareness. Mona Lisa further explicates to the reader that Leonardo, quote, "created me to show that there is a sensual longing of the spirit," end quote. According to Péladan, the work of art, then, explicitly had an instrumental purpose from the very start, to provide spiritual guidance to the initiate. Péladan's views on this matter did not merely remain on the printed page, but manifested themselves in ritual practices as well. In the esoteric system Péladan devised, Leonardo was a sort of saint or protector, and new members of l'Ordre du Temple de la Rose-Croix took the oath of the first degree in the name of the Italian painter. The latter can therefore be said to have played a fairly tangible cultic role. As we have seen, the artist as a mage and mystic was a leitmotif in Péladan's Rosicrucian salon. This teaching spread quickly, and many symbolist artists all over Europe soon took the concept to heart. One of them was Jean Delville, a collaborator of Péladan's, who was later to become the secretary of the Belgian section of the Theosophical Society. In his book La Mission de l'Art, Études d'esthétique idéaliste, from 1900, Delville expressed his fascination with Leonardo and claimed that Leonardo had stated, "Painting is the greatest mental labor, since necessity compels the painter's spirit to fuse itself with the very spirit of nature." Delville thus meant that Leonardo viewed painting as a near mystical act of communion with nature. Edouard Chouret, an author of esoteric dramas who was involved with movements like Theosophy and Anthroposophy, wrote an entire play in 1905 centered on the idea of Leonardo as a mage. Furthermore, in the journal The Theosophical Path, produced in Point Loma, California, but distributed worldwide, One C.J. Ryan published an article about Leonardo in which he was compared several times to Swedish esotericist Emanuel Swedenborg. And he also claimed that Leonardo's supposedly heterodox opinions on religious matters were similar to those of Swedenborg. For example, Ryan underscored that the wise Leonardo studiously avoided the introduction of halos or nimbuses around the figures in his sacred pictures. Such examples of idealized views of Leonardo as a pioneer of alternative spirituality among esotericists in the decades around the year 1900 could easily be multiplied. A professor of art history at l'École nationale des beaux-arts in Paris, Eugène Müntz, poignantly commented on the widespread tendency to esotericize Leonardo in his book Leonardo da Vinci, l'artiste, le penseur, le savant, of 1898. If we accept the ideas of certain scholars and novelists of our own times, Leonardo was heir to the great magi of antiquity and the precursor of such modern imitators as Dr. Papy, or even the Tsar Paladin. Then, somewhat sarcastically, he added, "So, each generation finds the need of ancestors." It is clear that the art historian was less than impressed, shall we say, by, quote, those who have wished to turn Leonardo into a sort of Mahatma, that is one of the hidden masters in theosophy. Yet he claimed to decline the task of passing judgment on this issue. "My knowledge," he wrote, "is limited, and my exegesis purely rationalist. For this I hope to be forgiven, and must leave the task of clearing up the mystery which shrouds the Italian Faust to those who are better equipped than myself." All the same, he immediately proceeded to attempt to clarify the matter, concluding that Leonardo never failed to set his face against anything esoteric. Yet, even Müntz himself clearly saw the idea's allure, if only from an aesthetic point of view. On the first pages of Volume 1 of his book, Müntz thus opined that Leonardo's famous red chalk self-portrait is, on the whole, suggestive of the Magus, not to say the magician. Indeed, throughout the book, he figuratively referred to Leonardo as a magician in a variety of contexts, in spite of distancing himself from literal understandings of the artist as such. The transformation of Leonardo into a sorcerer and esotericist, literally or metaphorically, naturally had consequences for his paintings as well, turning them into numinous objects filled with hidden knowledge and arcane symbols for the initiated to interpret. If Leonardo was an esotericist with access to secret teachings, his Mona Lisa must, as Paladin claimed, be filled with concealed signs and should properly be understood as a repository of mystical energies. After World War I, the more melodramatic fantasies about Leonardo as a magus largely faded and gave way to travesty and irony. In 1919, Marcel Duchamp created his famous parody of Leonardo's painting, where he scribbled a beard and a mustache onto a reproduction of it. A self-portrait as Mona Lisa by Salvador Dalí and many other takeoffs followed. The notion of Leonardo as an initiate and his work as filled with hidden messages was, however, still far from extinguished and reached a new apex in Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code of 2003. That, as the saying goes, is another story which lies beyond the scope of my present talk. It has been suggested that a tendency to view works of art as depositories of hidden spiritual knowledge is quite typical of esotericist discourse in general. As we have seen, this tendency was also prominent in European art criticism during the 19th century, even amongst those who were not by any stretch of the imagination esotericists themselves. This, I would claim, indicates a broader esotericization of art criticism than has been acknowledged earlier. It is well known that many symbolists, especially those associated with Paladin's salons, were colored in their perceptions by ideas from what is perhaps best described as esoteric new religions, such as theosophy and Rosicrucian orders. One way to understand this process is to view the discourse on Leonardo and the Gioconda as part of a 19th century occulture. This term was introduced into scholarship by Christopher Partridge, And though Partridge originally intended it to be applied primarily to the period from the end of World War II onward, Nina Kokkonen has persuasively argued that it has relevance for the 19th century as well. The same may be said of Colin Campbell's famous 1972 delineation of a heterogeneous cultic milieu as a repository of the various forms of rejected knowledge underpinning an eclectic multitude of new religious movements. It's worth noting here that Campbell himself emphasizes that the cultic milieu has deep historical roots. As Campbell describes it, the cultic milieu is kept alive by the magazines, periodicals, books, pamphlets, lectures, demonstrations, and informal meetings through which its beliefs and practices are discussed and disseminated. Unlike in formalized religious movements, these communication media are not bounded by the framework of the beliefs of a particular collectivity, but are generally open. The ideology of seekership that Campbell highlights as central to the cultic milieu fits well with the biographies of a majority of the esoterically inclined 19th century cultural figures. It would be quite feasible to think of the Rosicrucian salons and Paladin's writings as open forms of communication in Campbell's sense that disseminate to the general public ideas from more clandestine and ostracized esoteric discourses. Such activities and publications would then be key components in keeping alive and replenishing the fin de siècle cultic milieu, in which groups like l'Ordre du Temple de la Rose-Croix came and went. It seems likely that it was not only because Leonardo was an acknowledged master painter that esotericists by the turn of the century were routinely keen to incorporate him in their own genealogies and lineages. Rather, decades of prior esotericization of the man from Vinci gradually made him a name that would recur in esoteric discourse with a frequency not seen in relation to other historical artists. A key component in this esotericization was the idea of La Gioconda as an uncanny, mysterious painting, which converged with the theme of the supernatural femme fatale, so prominent in both popular and elite culture at the time. Moreover, art and religion had generally begun to blend in more and more idiosyncratic and individualistic ways towards the end of the 19th century. Artists and authors were often fascinated with the ritualism and trappings of religion or esotericism, even when they were unbelievers themselves. This turn-of-the-century cultic milieu was partly a recruitment pool for well-populated and somewhat tightly organized esoteric movements like Theosophy, but also, in accordance with Campbell's model, a cultural space that many entered without becoming long-term members of any group. Art, literature, and, perhaps surprisingly, art criticism, treating, for example, Leonardo, arguably played crucial roles in sustaining said milieu. We can also say that the esotericization of La Gioconda and its creator was something that took place in a context of a culture, which was, as Partridge underscores, an ordinary thing in some sense, not something obscure, drastically alternative and hidden from sight. Here, ideas from esoteric new religions mingled with themes from artistic currents. This potent mixture came to permeate contemporary discourse on Leonardo and made him and the smiling woman on his canvas mysterious and occultural. The absorption of a well-known older work of art into the occultural discourse subtly contributed to a re-enchantment of the world by making a secular, mundane painting magical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Per. You just saved me 2 slides for my talk tomorrow. So anyone coming tomorrow at 10 to the morning panel in here, you just heard who Paladin is, so I don't need to tell you. Questions? Because that was actually very, very interesting. No questions.
So I'm curious, with the esotericization of Leonardo, do you think that this is something that's still happening with celebrities or artists or stuff like that today? Because, I mean, there are just so many examples in mind, and so I'm curious what you think perhaps about contemporary iterations progression, perhaps, or a way of understanding these figures?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's something that's very much ongoing. And one example might be David Bowie. I'm sure many of you have seen papers at conferences about the occult interests of David Bowie. And usually the bottom line is he wasn't all that deeply into it. But this whole mythology surrounding David Bowie and his occult interests, and he's a very sort of perfect surface to project this onto. And there are so many other examples, of course, with these sort of Illuminati conspiracy theories and so on and so forth. But yes, I think this is a pattern that has repeated itself throughout history, but probably, and it probably goes even longer back in history than the 19th century. We can think of for example, the 18th century novel Le Diable Amoureux by Jacques Cazotte, which was very much sort of sucked into a sort of esotericizing discourse, even though its author, at least at the time he wrote it, wasn't really deeply into esotericism. Welcome.
Don't be shy. Plenty of time.
So just checking your Instagram, so you're very much into fashion.
Mm-hmm.
She is. She talks about the magic of fashion, or fashion magic, as performative art. Do you have anything to share on that topic?
Not at this moment, but I am in fact hoping to do a coffee table book on occult fashion.
Wow.
Awesome. We look forward.
You heard it here first, folks.
Are
Yep,
you,
yep.
will you be putting Paladin's purple velvet robes into that, or are you going to do 20?
I would very much like to, yes.
Good.
Alternative fashions, because I never make it to your Instagram. I'm not sharp enough.
We'll see, Kevin, we'll see.
That'll be the sequel. So, great, thanks.